I'm Doug Cuney and this is my kitchen. Welcome back to part 3 of making fresh rye bread. So you've added your salt water, you've incorporated it into your dough, and the dough has rested for an hour, which has given it time to kind of reincorporate itself. At this point there's no sense in testing your dough like you did your leaven. You already know how long it took your leaven to ferment in order to pass the float test. So knowing that amount of time, you know that your dough has already risen 1 hour after it was mixed and then an additional hour after you added the salt. So you can take that time and subtract 2 hours from it. Now, 2 hours before we bake it, we're going to shape the loaf. So subtract another 2 hours from the time that we're talking about, and you know how long it's going to rise now before we shape it. So you can set your loaf aside to rise for that amount of time, and then we'll be back and shape the loaf. Now if you're making both loaves, 2 loaves, the full recipe instead of just one, this is the time you want to divide your loaves. And it's messy, but the easiest way to do it is to simply turn your dough out onto your work surface. Take your bread spatula or the back side of a knife. You don't want to use a cutting edge because it'll damage your work surface. But simply just divide your dough, and you can just do it by eyeballing it. Divide your dough in 2, scoop it back, each half back, put half back in the original bowl, put the other half in another bowl, cover both of them with plastic wrap. Now as you can see, our dough has had a chance to rise and it's developed very well. It's very soft and full of air. It's about tripled in size. So at this point what we're going to do is shape the dough, put it up for 2 more hours, and then bake it. Put a little flour on the work surface. You don't want to put too much on. You don't want to add any appreciable amount of flour to the dough. And also you actually want the dough to stick to the work surface just a little bit. And I'll show you why in a moment. We'll take our bread spatula and very gently turn the dough out. It's still very sticky. Now I've got what they call a bench scraper, and you can use the bread spatula for this if you want. These are a little stiffer obviously, and they do make it a little easier. If you don't have one, your bread spatula might work. I'm going to take some flour and apply it to the top. This is basically to just try to keep it from sticking to everything. Alright, now we'll start at one edge and we'll just scoot it. And in this case I'm going to have to use the damp bread spatula. Started a stretched edge and roll it. So we'll start from this edge, the long edge actually, I guess was what you'd call it. Now see what's happening as you roll this along is that it tucks the loaf underneath and it stretches the surface on the top. and that's going to help develop the crust. It's got a nice tight surface on it. So I've got myself a piece of parchment paper. I'm going to set that down. And then simply set it right on the parchment paper. Now, in order to help it kind of keep its shape, I'm going to set this in a colander. And that will help it retain its round loaf shape. Now you've got your loaves shaped, and you've got them on parchment paper. You've got them set in the colanders or their containers, and you're going to let these sit for another 2 hours, your final 2 hours, and allow them to rest and to rise a little more. And then we'll bake them. You're going to want to cover them. You can use cloth in this case because you actually want the surface to dry just slightly to help develop the crust. It's not absolutely necessary. You can use any cloth. I like to use this piece of linen simply because linen, if it comes in contact with the moist bread, it doesn't leave little lint, little fibers in it. We'll give these 2 more hours to rest, but before then we'll be back in an hour and start preheating our oven. Right now we're 1 hour away from baking our bread, so that means you need to preheat your oven and your Dutch ovens. I have a pair of Dutch ovens that I use because I can actually get 2 into my oven. If you only have 1, that's not a problem. Just preheat that, and then you'll bake your bread in sequence rather than both at the same time. So I'm going to place the Dutch ovens in the oven and preset it to 525 degrees, and we'll give it an entire hour to heat up, and then we'll bake our bread. Well, we finally reached the point where the Dutch oven is up to temperature. It's preheated. It's at 525 degrees, and it's time to bake bread. The one thing we're going to want to do is relieve the tension on the surface of the bread. Now, if you cut the surface tension, then that surface will open up and the bread will be allowed to spring to a higher level. So what you're going to need is a knife or a razor blade, single-sided razor blade that you can get in a hardware store, that sort of thing. This that I'm using is actually a wallpaper knife that I got at a paint store and then bent the end of it at a 45-degree angle so it's a little bit easier to make, or a little easier to make a cut. So I'm going to actually just slice the surface just enough to relieve the tension. See, now that's actually opening up even now because of the release of tension within the loaf itself. And on this one, I'm going to do something a little more creative. Now, not only does the cutting of the surface of the loaf relieve tension, but it actually serves a purpose in the baking world in that in many old traditional bakeries, they would actually use different cuts for different types of bread. That way the baker could identify the bread readily without having to, well, just by looking at it. So now we'll put these in the oven. All right, we've got our oven mitts, our burned up old oven mitts. If you need to have some of these, or get yourself some heavy towels that you can use. I'm going to remove these Dutch ovens from the oven one at a time and put the bread in them. Turn the light on so I can see what I'm doing. You're going to want to work fairly quickly so that you can keep that heat in the oven. Now, part of the reason of putting the bread on parchment paper is because this dough is so highly hydrated, it's difficult to handle on its own. Now, the paper is going to char a little bit, but don't worry about it. We'll get a second one in here. And you can't really see it probably from your angle, but as that bread hits that bottom, that 525 degree base in this Dutch oven, it's already starting to open up. All right, so at this point we will set our timer for 20 minutes, and we will decrease the temperature to 450 degrees. Now we'll let this bake for 20 more minutes. All right, at this point your bread has baked for 20 minutes, and what has happened is the steam developed by that damp dough has built up inside of those Dutch ovens. And in doing so, it's really developed the crust very nicely. Now what we have to do is remove the lids. Watch for that hot blast coming out of there. Yeah, those are looking real good. And that will release the remaining moisture that was inside the Dutch ovens and allow that those crusts to crisp up in the heat. So we will reset our timer for 20 more minutes. All right, our bread is ready to come out. I'll shut the timer off. That looks real good. All right, now this charred paper is, see, this is going to break off, but if you can get hold of a couple pieces of the less charred, there we are. Now, if you're like most people, the first thing you're going to want to do is cut into your bread. Try to avoid doing that. Try to let your bread cool for a couple hours. Well, I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, leave them for me in the comment section. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my channel and share these videos with your friends. My name is Doug Cuney. Until next time, take care.